Hello everyone, my name is Miss Cali Je. I am an Episcopalian Christian, a gay person, non-binary, a drag queen, the holder of an English degree, and most importantly for today, I am president of a nonprofit called Reading Time with the Queens. Today I am going to tell you a story. This is the story of how religion has blessed and cursed Reading Time with the Queens time and again. Fitting, I think, to tell a story because it's all about telling stories. In fact, Reading Time with the Queen's mission is to have drag performers read stories that will teach us how to accept and love ourselves and others. I am the president of Reading Time with the Queens, but I am not alone. I currently run the program with several other amazing people. I'm just curious, with a raise of hands, who here has some idea of what a drag story time is? Okay, most everybody. Okay, cool. So we have some cultural reference for this. I started Reading Time with the Queens with this person, Zay. Back then, we were Miss Cali and Miss Zay, two Southeast Idaho gay pride pageant title holders. Along with Miss Marina, we performed the first Reading Time with the Queens at our public library in Pocatello, Idaho. This was our attempt at community service. I particularly felt strongly about doing something to improve our community as local title holders. Until we created Reading Time, most of our activities had been about fundraising for the next pageant. It felt selfish to me, and frankly, I found that the idea of holding a title for the purpose of boasting alone to be a grotesque misuse of our community's funds and energies. Pocatello is a small town in a conservative region, but we boast the only gay bar in 150 miles. We have resources, but not many, and not many are family friendly. What if we could use our talents to create the program that Zay and I needed when we were kids? And how cool would it be if we took the model that was being used in big cities by Drag Story Hour and used it in our relatively small town? And how extra amazing would it be if we could add sign language and deaf inclusion to that original model? That is the start of the story. And as I tell you the story, I'm going to highlight two things. I am going to provide some information about how our program runs itself. Reading Time is a secular program, but because I work on it and because we live in a predominantly conservative Christian LDS area, there are aspects of spirituality that inform our decisions. So the second thing I'm going to do is highlight moments where spirituality or religion has touched Reading Time, for better or worse. We'll start with a fun example. The format that we used for our first program is more or less the same format I have come back to for every program since. At this point in my life, I'd been attending an Episcopal church for about 2 years. In figuring out how to structure the program, I decided to go with what I knew, a format I still to this day joke as being the Episcopalian method. Simply put, the format is such: opening hymn, collect, lesson, response, lesson, response. The collect, you'll note, is where we learn American Sign Language. And it's in theme. This is taught by Zay, who is deaf. It is not a revolutionary model, but I like thinking about it like this because it invites me to think about how every element of the program is commenting on the others. This also tickles the part of my brain that got a BA in English because I was constantly comparing and contrasting texts in my classes at university. That leads me to another point I'd like to highlight. At our very first ever program, one of my professors, Dr. Amanda Zink, invited me to think about ways in which our program could expand outside the confines of queer identity. She said, you know, you don't have to make it the same if you do it again. It doesn't have to be about drag queens or LGBTQ books every time. You can use it as a platform to feature other topics or cultures as well. This was by far the most instrumental piece of advice that I've ever received about reading time. When I was working with Zay to pick out those first books, I remember feeling like I had to pick queer narratives only, as if that was the only thing that I, a drag queen, would be allowed to talk about. Even back then, we weren't starved for children's books about queerness. But when someone that I respected gave me permission to read narratives and teach outside of a queer bubble, that was liberating. Lessons I learned. Not everything in your program has to be about queerness. Have programs where it's front and center and others where queerness is only a component. Don't limit your program. Also, not everyone in your program has to be a drag queen. There are many community members your attendees deserve to meet. Bring them to the table as well. Zay and I would continue producing programs until our titles were up. I missed out on the last program of our reign because I made a mistake. Where are you at? Place where the internationally famous and renowned Corvallis, Oregon. Go Beavs. Yeah, it's not. Okay. I got a job at a bookstore in downtown Corvallis, and eventually I was invited to put on a program there. The first one I did with them was part of their independent. It was not well attended. I did it by myself, put together the program how I'd done it before. I had to leave out the ASL, unfortunately, since I no longer had Zay as my partner. Even so, I named it Reading Time with the Queens, despite being the only queen. There were a few kids that wandered in. Even though they were late, I had a fun time reading the end of the book to them. Here are two things I learned. Sometimes child attends. Those programs are still important because you still get to make an impact on that one child's life. Also, it is way especially Frisky, the transgender reindeer. Her real name is Dharma Krishna. My friend much of their drag. Pocatello is dominated by white queens. The drag scene in Corvallis is still run by non-binary transgender people of color. Dharma, or Frisky, or Hojabi, as she goes by sometimes, is a Desi Kwajasira, a Pakistani third gender. My personal drag was transformed by her performances where she gave herself estrogen shots on stage, spoke openly about HIV, and incorporated Pakistani music into her performances. We did a lot of drag together, and I did two notable reading time programs with Dharma. The first was a huge program at the Corvallis Library for Pride Month. We worked specifically to find literature by non-white authors. Dharma read a book called From the Stars in the Sky to the Fish in the Sea by Kai Cheng Tom, Kai Yun Chin, and Wayant Lee. I found joy in having a huge group of kids and their families join together in making music. Me on my ukulele, the kids beating arrhythmically on their shakers. Something I learned: diversity is powerful. Your attendees, planners, performers, and program will benefit from a variety of people and their viewpoints, especially if you treat it like it is normal, because it should be. The second program was a bit more complex. Around this time, awareness was growing about the atrocities that the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement was and is inflicting on immigrants coming across the U.S.'s southern border. I was outraged about the kids in cages policy that was tearing families apart and inflicting trauma on children. To this day, when I learn about another way that the US is causing suffering, I feel helpless to do anything. And at the time, I was doing monthly reading time programs at my workplace. I spoke about this feeling of helplessness with a coworker, and she suggested I do a reading time program as an awareness fundraiser. The thought had never occurred to me, but after some thinking, I agreed it was a good place to put my energies. I didn't feel right to ask my job to host it, so I turned to my next option, my church. I attended Good Samaritan Episcopal the entire time I lived in Corvallis. I was even received into the Episcopal Church at Good Sam. To this day, I hold the rector, Father Simon, in my heart as one of the most influential people in my life. I asked him if I could host our program at church, and he dutifully recommended that I speak with the church board, the vestry. I had a few odd meetings with the senior warden, and for most of that experience, I was none the wiser that there was significant pushback against this idea. This was 2018. The vestry of my mainline Christian church could not fathom the idea of drag that was family friendly, let alone meant for kids. If it were not for a couple of queer-affirming vestry members who advocated on my behalf, I would have been rejected from using space at my own church's building. I cannot express how much it would have hurt me if that happened. Thankfully, it did not happen. I was allowed to use the church for this fundraiser. When I was growing up Baptist, I learned to refer to these kind of moments as a God thing. But that was not a spontaneous bit of good fortune. If I am to credit God here, I must also note that God helped through people who were open to God's will. Lessons I learned. No matter how accepting your own sect is, you will always find ignorance. Also, get some allies. To say that the program went off without a hitch would be disingenuous. Nothing bad happened. The program did raise awareness of the work that Kids in Need of Defense was doing to provide legal aid to immigrant children. The owners of the bookshop I worked at donated money. Good Samaritan made Kind their last Sunday plate offering charity, and other friends and acquaintances sent in funds. We raised a few $100s. The program itself had one single baby that attended with their mother, as well as a handful of adult parishioners from Good Sam. We performed the program anyways, singing Mr. Rogers' Won't You Be My Neighbor, and Sesame Street's Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood? Dharma read a book called Marjuan's Journey by Patricia DR&SS and Laura Barras, a story about a young refugee boy. When creating this program, I relearned what it is to be a neighbor when I searched for material on how to explain immigration to children. Lessons I learned. Storytime programs do not lend themselves to being fundraisers. Share the message, but hesitate to turn a free event for families into an event where people are pressured to give money. Also, there is something powerful in being forced to boil an international crisis down to its essential parts for an audience of children. I found living in Corvallis difficult. I found out that just because people in an area are generally liberal doesn't mean they are generally kind. When I was growing up in Idaho, someone may see you on the street and not like you, but they would at least have the decency to wait until they're home to say anything negative about you. Idaho's way is what some people call live and let live, which definitely has its downsides. In Corvallis, people loved to tell you just what they thought about you right there on the street. I couldn't stand that way of living. My discontent turned to anger, which led to attitude problems, which led to me getting fired from my bookstore job. While I was looking for a new job, I realized I was more comfortable where I'd grown up. I wanted to go back to my friends. I wanted to take what I'd learned and thrive where I was comfortable. So I moved back to Pocatello. But before I left, I had a meeting with Father Simon. I explained to him some of the reasons why I wanted to leave. I recounted feeling angry every day, inexplicably so, at people I knew and people I didn't know. I'd felt like I'd absorbed that culture of judging others for how they looked or acted while they merely walked on by. I still remember Father Simon's response. He said, "Sometimes when I experience someone acting in a way I disagree with, instead of becoming mad, I simply ask, why? Why may they be acting that way? What is going on in their life that is affecting them?" By remaining curious, I gain empathy in that moment. Much later, I would write this idea into an original reading time song called Perseverance. Those middle lyrics say, "Everyone has their own goals and dreams. Value is sewn into all of our seams. Exceptional reactions are not a guarantee. Remain curious about all that you see." Once I got back to Pocatello, one of the first questions I got was, "Are you going to start reading Time with the Queens back up?" One way that I still believe that God speaks to me is through people who are close to me. With Zay's partnership, we restarted Reading Time with the Queens in June 2019 as a monthly program at the local public library with plans to incorporate as a nonprofit. It took some time before our program had to contend with anti-drag bias, however. Drag Story Hour is the original international nonprofit which Reading Time with the Queens draws inspiration from, but not direct association. Michelle T created Drag Story Hour in 2015, but it took until 2020 for Reading Time to feel any notable pushback at the local level. In the lead up to our February 2020 program, a ton of new people found out that Reading Time existed after a far-right influencer shared a picture he had taken at a Starbucks of one of our posters. He wasn't from Pocatello, he was just passing through town. I don't know if you can read it. It says, "Looky what your tax dollars are paying for in Pocatello, Idaho!" With that exact enunciation. Before I knew it, a far-right Christian streamer called Warriors for Christ started ranting about Reading Time. They actually called me a 24-year-old homosexual with no children of his own, which at the time I made my Twitter bio. Then a local man announced his plans to lead a protest against us. Suddenly, I was being contacted by local TV and print news about Reading Time. I think that what struck people most is that this program was taking place in as small of a community as Pocatello. And in the infancy of this new wave of the anti-trans movement, I also think that we were considered an easy target because of where we lived. Thankfully, the hullabaloo amounted only to increased awareness of our program. On the day, we had to run through the program twice, and each time the room was filled to capacity. The local man who planned to protest us called off his plans after, frankly, being bullied out of it. I recall this man reaching out to me, and I found what he wrote in part. It said, "This has all gotten so ugly. I was seeking to ensure there was a community awareness, and there certainly is now. But there's also vitriol and hatred and lies, and it's horrendous. My wife has had some nasty things said to her, and people are saying they'll keep their kids from mine so the bigotry doesn't rub off. Please know I don't hate you. If this brought feelings that made you feel hated, I apologize from the bottom of my heart. Again, please just let the kids stay innocent for as long as humanly possible. God bless." I wrote a considerate reply that included the phrase, "We actually share a common concern. I think we both just want what is best for our community and our community's children. This was the last time I had anything resembling a conversation with someone who did not like reading time, but it would not be the last time we were protested. One notable thing that happened during this period that I will carry with me for the rest of my life is this. During church, one of my priests, Father Don, invited me to stand before the congregation. I did not know he was planning this, but when he gestured for me, I had some idea about what it was about. At that point, it felt like reading time with the Queens was the only thing that anyone in my town could talk about. At least that's how it felt to me, a queen. Father Don knew exactly what I was going through and how much criticism and confusing attention we were experiencing, so he took the time to encourage me and bless our work. I knew that Don cared about me and my well-being, but I never thought that something like reading time would be or could be blessed. In that moment, parts of me healed that had been broken for a long time. Lessons I learned. Pocatellians are most likely to support you when things are at their most dire. Also, you need to make a choice now about how you are going to conduct yourself when you are in a difficult situation. As queer people, we could choose to act better than our oppressors. I choose to act with gentleness when possible because I'm trying to represent a queer Christianity. Also, the work that Reading Time does is blessed. The popularity we gained as a program was short-lived, however, because the next month was when public awareness of the spreading COVID-19 disease started. Reading Time didn't stop producing programming, we just got really good at practicing our program online. We spent 2 years making program for Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, all filmed in my basement apartment, except for a few times. We partnered with a little free library and a bookstore to distribute craft kits. We got better at picking music and books, refined our commitment to ASL education, and maintained awareness of our program. There isn't much I want to say about this time period, but I would like to mention that we did do a whole program about my favorite Presbyterian, Mr. Rogers. It was the most calm I ever felt during a program, summarizing the ethos of Fred Rogers for the families in Southeast Idaho. I was doing everything online. I went to church online. I was in the vestry of this church that met online. I met my partner playing D&D online. And we put on Reading Time online. I called this period Wandering in the Wilderness more than once because it felt like we were just waiting to return to the good work we'd only started. Lessons I learned. Patience. Once vaccinations were readily available, things started to be in person again. I started encountering people who thought we had fully disappeared even though we'd been online every month. The community room space we'd used for programs at the library still hadn't been converted back from being used as storage. So we started performing at a bookstore in Idaho Falls, which is a town about 50 miles north of Pocatello, and a community building called Station Square in downtown Pocatello. Then the question I got all the time was, when are you going to be back at the library? People associated us with that space. It made sense to me. Story times take place in the public library or a bookstore, someplace associated with reading, darling. So, in September of 2022, we finally were back in the library, and in October of 2022, our monthly program day shifted to including 2 performances. One at the bookstore in Idaho Falls, and then a second one at our local library in Pocatello. Ooh boy. Here's some things I'll say about doing 2 programs a day. First of all, it is difficult, but it is rewarding. It is very cool to know that we've grown our program, and it's cool to know that our board is willing to take an entire Saturday and dedicate it to doing reading time. This is the typical schedule for me as a drag performer doing a reading time day. You can see that it's a long day, and I don't think that everyone should do it. One thing I will say is that having people that live in both towns helps in case we forget something or we need someone to substitute. It's also very fulfilling to serve two communities on the same day. And you'd be surprised how different the programs can be depending on the audience. My team knows that the kids in Idaho Falls are very talkative and have lots of great insights, while the kids in Pocatello are often younger and quieter. It helps that we're doing the same program twice, of course, because by the time we get to Pocatello, we pretty much know the drill. Lessons I've learned. With hard work and commitment, you can consider the idea of performing in different places throughout the day. Also, make sure your schedule is rooted in consistency so that you, your team, and your community have the opportunity to know exactly what is going on. Consistency specifically has been very elusive for reading time in the past couple of years. You might notice that I said Pocatello venue in the prior schedule. That is because since the start of 2023, our Pocatello program has taken place in 4 different places, not counting the venues we use for Pride festivals. In October of 2022, a Christian nationalist organization called Idaho Family Policy Center announced that in addition to introducing and promoting several transphobic bills, they would be introducing a bill that banned public drag. The drag community in Idaho were immediately in uproar, including me. The picture that made the rounds in the initial news article was of a queen reading The Hips on the Drag Queen by Little Miss Hot Mess. I knew which drag queens they wanted gone. The month prior, Idaho Family Policy Center launched a petition that falsely claimed that a drag queen had exposed herself at a pride event in northern Idaho, then named reading time and stated that what we did was an erotic fetish. By the way, this article lied that the Idaho Family Policy Center verified genital exposure, a fact that has been debunked so hard that the queen in question won $1.1 million US. Just last week, it was reported that Miss Million is finally able to sue the Idaho Family Policy Center for lying. And in response, this Christian organization doubled down on their lie, calling it a leftist bullying tactic. So, real Christian organization we got there in Idaho. We had worked so hard to build our program into a place where families felt safe and could learn. And the thought that ignorant legislation could ban us from public was unnerving. I did everything I could to stop this from happening. I coordinated a statewide postcard campaign asking our legislators to protect drag in Idaho. This was, of course, when I still believed that some Republicans had a conscience. I will say, at the time, I was frustrated that people were willing to put so much work into stopping a ban on drag, and relatively less was being done to address the many anti-trans laws that were being proposed and passed. I tried my best to coordinate all of this while maintaining our monthly program. In February of 2023, exactly 3 years after our first brush with protesters, we had a life-altering experience. I should have seen it coming. There had been the occasional group of protesters outside of our Pocatello programs around the end of 2022. I'd encountered some hate literature from a group called Mass Resistance. I paid as much attention to it as I could. I asked a friend, Angela, who was there 3 years ago, to put together a troop of umbrellas to shield our families and their kids from protesters. This is an idea that was created by a U.S. group called Parasol Patrol. We call our version Rainbow Umbrellas. One member of that troop of umbrellas is actually my current priest in charge, Reverend Haiti. You can see her wearing denim in that rightmost picture. I don't think that most of our participants know that a clergy person is standing guard outside of reading time, but I know, and that brings me joy. At the time, I just remember believing the same thing that happened in 2020 was happening again. Some people who didn't like us were making noise and inadvertently making our program more popular. But that February, a group of people under the banner of nationally recognized hate group Mass Resistance rode a bus owned by Mountain Valley Baptist, a relatively new local church. It wasn't just Baptists in the bus, there were also Mormons, and even someone who attended the local synagogue, which I only know because my then vice president, Rowan, who is Jewish, recognized him and said, "See you at Shabbat service," before we left. They were led by a twice failed political candidate and local staff. One of the first gay marriages in the US. And when we were done, we left, and they stayed so their pastor could preach to them. This is really hard for me to recount, and it's harder to do so without all the nitty-gritty details. For the first time, I felt unsafe in my hometown. And unlike before, where I felt like I could at least have a conversation with someone I disagreed with, I felt then, and I still feel to this day, that there is no reconciling that can be done. I still feel like hate has infiltrated my town, moved into a shell of an old Presbyterian church with plans to persecute anyone who doesn't fit their vision. It cuts me even more knowing that they are Baptist, just like I was once Baptist. It felt like my childhood bully had showed up to my house just to punch me in the gut. I wish that I could live up to Father Simon's lesson, but I can only conclude that the why that they are acting this way is simply that they hate us. And even today, I feel anger and despair, and sometimes I sit in the choir loft at Trinity Episcopal and hallucinate that they're in my church, waiting to take away another safe space. It's not well with my soul. God, working through people, has provided me with an amazing team, however, including a band of umbrella holders there to shield us and our families from hate. And without them, I don't know where I'd be. I do not go through this work alone, and I keep doing it because I know that how I feel now is how other kids feel. And I have to keep on being a light in my community, an example of a queer person who kept going, because there are children in Pocatello who need that example. Lessons I learned. Get yourself a crew of umbrellas. It won't solve everything, but it is a good way of practicing nonviolent protection. Also, we've entered a new era of anti-queer politics. There is so much I want to say about this event. I have to mention that, throughout all the aftermath and the publicity, I am still grateful to live in my community. For a while, it felt like it was Pocatello versus Mountain Valley Baptist. And while I know that is reductive and untrue, I am glad that people recognized the absurdity of the situation and felt inspired to call it out. LDS stake leaders denounced the protest in the paper, despite some of their members being protesters. A huge crowd of people, supporters, and protesters of our program flooded the City Hall building during a contentious library board meeting and demanded things change. Eventually, the city's legal council determined that the protesters were very much allowed to interrupt our program and protest how they wished. The Baptist church leaders took a victory lap, believing they'd won. Lessons I learned. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is worthless if no one is willing to defend it. Our right as queer people to use public resources peaceably took a back seat to the city legal department's opinion. We didn't feel safe being in the library after that, so we kept on with our plans to hold our March program. And thankfully, my vice president, Rowan, asked his rabbi, Rabbi Sarah, if we could use their synagogue and Jewish community center. And she said yes. I'd never stepped foot into a synagogue before this point, but Rowan had keys, and we were both desperate for a safe space. And if he felt comfortable, I felt comfortable. It's important to note that we felt especially safe for Mountain Valley Baptist in a Jewish space, betting that they wouldn't dare risk the optics of being both queerphobic and anti-Semitic at the same time. It felt like an act of solidarity. They even facilitated entire safety meetings with us, inviting law enforcement allies in their community to be in dialogue with us. And on one hand, it was jarring to be making evacuation plans with cops in case there was an attack on a children's program. On the other hand, I felt like my friends at the synagogue were all in on keeping us safe. Our reading time board, however, was hesitant. They agreed on the synagogue, but they weren't sure that doing our secular program in a religious space was a good idea. I could hardly comprehend the notion at the time. To me, this felt like the safest place we could possibly have it. The only reason I didn't ask to have it at my church is because I am naturally anxious. I still remembered the time I was almost disallowed from holding a program at my Corvallis church, and I couldn't handle the thought of being rejected by my home church in the same way. But the program went on, and it was beautiful. It was all about sewing. We taught participants how to sign sew and make. I sang Coat of Many Colors. We read Joseph Had a Little Overcoat, my favorite book. Mr. Rowan's mother, a costumer, joined us as a reader. Rabbi Sarah noted that we'd chosen literature that was notably Jewish, even though it was a coincidence. I'd been planning the program since way before we had to leave the library. It felt like something new had been created that day. We did an April program at a different location, a dog grooming business. Naturally, it was titled, Ooh, Dogs! And then we did our May program back at the synagogue. Again, it was a wonderful time. We felt honored to be there. Some members of our team even helped clean the space in preparation for Passover. Lessons I learned. You can find allies in unexpected places. In June, we performed our programs at our local Pride festivals, as usual. There were protesters there, wasting their time behind the colors of the rainbow umbrellas. In the lead up to our July program, I got some heartbreaking texts. Despite Rabbi Sarah's wishes and the wishes of other allies on the synagogue's board, we were disinvited from performing programs there again. This was really hard for me, of course. We'd done nothing wrong, nothing to disrespect the space or the people that revere it. There was just that internal politic, the exact same element I'd seen in my own church, keeping people wary. One of the saddest parts for me was that the non-religious members of Reading Times Board felt justified in their initial trepidation. When we were looking for a next space, we were no longer inclined to consider any remotely spiritual space. We just felt downtrodden. A lesson I learned. The place where you feel most welcomed might be the place where others feel less than welcome. Sometimes religious spaces are a bad fit for a program meant for all. For the first time since incorporating, we took a month off. We canceled our July program while we looked for a new venue. In August, we settled into a dance school and have been performing there since. And in the past year, as anti-transgender sentiment grows and Idaho's queer community flees or hides, our program attendance has sharply declined. Our program really has felt like it has been in a holding pattern since early last year, despite the many great things we've created. If you look online, you could probably assume we are doing great. And while it is true that we are doing our job better than ever, it does feel like we are waiting for the other shoe to drop. I do need to share a happy thing that came out of all of this, however. Rabbi Sarah has remained a wonderful ally and a good friend. Last December, we created a program all about Hanukkah together, and in May of this year, she joined us once more for a program about unicorns. That second program was very special to me because the entire cast was full of people who were notably spiritual friends of mine, including Mr. Zay, Mr. Aaron, and Bonnie Violet. It was also another program where, unfortunately, we had protesters. And this time, they were in Idaho Falls. Here's what happened. A local magazine published a short blurb about the Idaho Falls bookstore we mentioned, and mentioned that they host Reading Time with the Queens once a month. This led to people who were ignorant of our monthly presence at the bookstore suddenly becoming aware that we performed there. And this instance reinforced an opinion of mine. As we've navigated how to advertise our program, I've shied away from more traditional forms of media. Conversations with other event planners and bookstores who have hosted programs like ours have led me to conclude a few things. First, of the mainstream social media sites, and I'm not counting X, Facebook is the most unsafe for promoting queer events. It is much too easy for a local person to share a post promoting your Reading Time event to their hateful audience, which will only be fueled by Facebook's documented pro-outrage algorithm. Use Facebook sparingly. Also, keep your program off of mainstream advertisements if possible. Focus your advertising on businesses and community centers that are queer-friendly rather than promote your program where people with ill intent can see it. In the week before this May program, I was privately frantic. When the bookstore owners contacted me saying that they were getting phone calls from people displeased that we were being hosted there, I was afraid we were going to lose our space again. And then I got this email. It said, "You better stay out of Idaho. That's all I'm gonna say. We don't take pieces of shit like you fucking with our kids." This was the only communication that Reading Time received directly, but I was even more terrified. This is when I realized I think I still have trauma about what happened last year. Thankfully, the bookstore owners invited me to a small bookstore association workshop. And among the many things we discussed, I would like to pass on two things that were most meaningful to me. First one, you've got to find the difference between a threat and a message that is threatening. Also, canceling the program you're putting on because you feel scared is actually what the protesters want. I had to realize that we were doing everything right by staying aware, making a safety plan ahead of time, keeping families and kids shielded with umbrellas. We even had help from the Idaho Falls Pride Organization to act as plainclothes security, which is my favorite kind, because I never want kids to feel like they need to be scared. I want families to feel joy when they attend, to read, sing, craft, and sign with us. The protest amounted to 3 men who parked themselves by a bookshelf and kept trying to film the program. They wanted to catch us doing something wrong, but our team politely reminded them that 1, we already film and post our program every month on YouTube. Also 2, don't film kids without parental permission. So here's some lessons to learn. 1, film your programs yourself. Also, Don't film kids without parental permission. One protester was surprised that Rabbi Sarah had joined us for this program. He talked with her afterwards and asked her how she, a religious leader, could support a program like ours. And she replied, "How could I not?" She said she believed that it was her imperative as a Jewish person to love her neighbor because God created us all. She made sure to tell us about that conversation after it happened. At the time, I was so tired, and I was specifically frustrated that I had to spend so much of my mental energy monitoring the presence of protesters at our children's program. But now I can look back, see what a gift that was, to have us all in that room, teaching children, parents, and protesters alike. And it wouldn't have been the same without Rabbi Sarah there, or without Bonnie Violet there, or without Zay there, or without me. A Methodist, Episcopalian, a spiritual drag artist, and a rabbi walk into a bookstore. That's a story I want to be a part of. Lessons I've learned. It will be difficult. Also, keep going. How does the story end? It will end, I think, but I don't know how. But I think it is notable to express that Reading Time's story is not its own story. Our story is only part of a greater, larger story about our queer community's path towards liberation. It is not fair to say that religious has been all bad when it comes to Reading Time's story, but it is notable that religion has played a role in many of the lowest moments for the program as well. Despite our constant tension with religion, my belief is that Reading Time is blessed and therefore can be a vehicle for love and acceptance of many types. I hope that you will become part of the story and take the spirit of Reading Time into your community, because we can all be part of the story, but it will take more than our work in Southeast Idaho for others to know the story. I feel like I've shared a lot of the troubling details about my program. So to counterbalance that, I'd like to share some of my favorite things that I've experienced at Reading Time programs. First thing, our program notably has an emphasis, like I've mentioned, on teaching American Sign Language and promoting deaf inclusion. I've had the honor of working to make our program as deaf inclusive as possible with the past and present help of Mr. Zay, Miss Kylie, and Mr. Aaron. In April of this year, my voice is going, Mr. Buster, in the red overalls, decided to talk about his trans identity at a program. We called it Meet Mr. Buster, and even though he'd picked out all the books to explain what being transgender meant to him, on the day he felt really sheepish. I kind of had to pull him out of the closet a bit, and towards the end of the program, I asked why he picked those books, and he finally mustered the courage to say to the kids, "I am transgender." And without missing a beat, a kid piped up and said, "That's okay. One of my mom's best friends is trans, and we play Beat Saber together." I've had the honor of having my Nana, my Gramps, and my Aunt Danny as guests for our program. I love to use the work of Mr. Rogers in our programs. One of my favorite songs to sing is "Then Your Heart is Full of Love," which I've also been invited to sing once at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Boise. Speaking of Unitarian Universalists, Reading Time does have a lot of allies that attend our UUF in Pocatello, including my friend, the Reverend Jenny Peak. That middle picture is me playing La Befana in their Festival of Lights. I feel mixed about this one, but the month I returned from Drag and Spirituality Summit last year, Reading Time won several awards, including one from the Pocatello branch of the NAACP and one from the Human Relations Advisory Committee of the City of Pocatello. That second one was kind of hard to process because we were being given an award on behalf of the same city that had failed to protect us earlier that year. I think it goes to show that there are complex disagreements within all institutions, whether they are religious spaces, nonprofits, or city governments. Also, in that month's program, I used a technique that I learned at Dragon Spirituality Summit that incorporates narrative movement to the lyrics of a song. Perhaps the most unlikely person on our board is Miss Barb, who is a 63-year-old woman and the original ally. She is our crafting queen and has taught me a lot about what it is to be a friend. One thing that we do once a year is a science time with the queens, where we invite a real life expert in a scientific field and refocus our program on a science activity. Don't worry, they're still reading. Reading time has been going on so long that this kid, who is a member of my church, is now in middle school. I feel old. I should also mention that Reading Time started a teen book club last year with the help of a partner organization named The Closet. We call it Reading Time with the Teens, and it has hosted to date 8 bi-monthly programs. So I have questions. Has anyone else in this room put on children's programming that would like to share their experience with these topics? If not, what would you envision as one of the things that you'd run into? Anxieties you have. Anxieties I just gave you. The library is open. Questions just about the program. Mhm.
to learn about sexual exploitation or something like that, and they are saying that we're um, teaching children to be more aggressive, to say no, or to be revolutionary. It's like,
Uh-huh.
but we're saying that it's just right for them to be aggressive, to say no. It's just right for them to be revolutionary of changing the norms that children can say no, not to um, bear all this um, grooming or exploitation that they don't know. So
Mhm.
it's right to to teach children what their right is, that they are being exploited, they are being abused. So although I ended it up, but um, because unlike cure, I feel that you don't hold back. Me, I was holding back when I was doing that, running the program, because I feel like I don't want to offend the church, the ministers, the parents. I don't want to offend in running that even though we're making modules as well for them and reading for them, we have to really careful of the words of all the that's why yeah it I feel like you know we I wish our team also have that more courage, more bravery than what you did there. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, I don't want to simplify what you just said, but it sounds like you're doing very important work teaching children about consent. Yeah. And that's very difficult in a world that traditionally does not know how to do that. I kind of have a personal opinion that, at least in Idaho, um, we kind of live with this idea that children are property. And so it doesn't surprise me that in other places in the world, they also believe that teaching children that they have power over their own bodies is thought of as, what was the word you used? Like aggressive? That's, yeah. I applaud you for doing that work. And I'm sorry that it was difficult, but I hope that you'll find the strength to continue it on in some capacity one day.
So, hi, I'm Ben from Vancouver, and we recently put an ecumenical group together and did our first drag communion, uh, which I insist. At first they're saying, "Well, can we do it on another day?" It's like, no, it has to be visible. It has to be Sunday morning. You have to put queer people in charge for this event, and we ultimately ended. And now 8 other churches are asking to host it, which is incredible. We very intentionally played it safe on the first event. We knew there would be children present. We did not have a children's message or children's time. And I'm wondering, within that sacred church context, what kind of advice you might have as we plan our next event and work on integrating these elements of explicitly bringing drag story time for kids into that service.
That's a good question. So I did something kind of like that. I showed a picture of it earlier when I was at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Boise, and the only thing I can say really is to, I don't know exactly what the relationship you have with these other congregations is. So I think everyone's going to be bringing their own stuff, right? I drew, like I mentioned that I do, for Mr. Rogers because I mean he's a Christian, and also I find a lot of what he was speaking about to be very queer. And when I'm, singing songs like "Then Your Heart Is Full of Love," he says, when your heart has room for everybody, then your heart is full of love. Things like that. Like those are things that really speak to all of us. And I guess leading into my next point would be, um, I think it's kind of possible to overthink the drag element of it. Um, Whenever I'm having performers come, either if they're part of our board or if I just know them and, they're coming to read for the day, I ask them to consider what they're dressing as, and I don't tell them things that they can't do. I just say, I need you to dress like you are literally a character in a storybook, right? And that's what kids are identifying with. On a personal note, I do this type of work because I want kids to see the representation that I needed when I was a kid. And so sometimes you don't need to go into those topics. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. And sometimes we do, like when Mr. Buster came out as trans, but sometimes just being there is a way to say, I see you. And it gives, and maybe those children will identify as queer later in life, and maybe they won't, but either way, they're going to know somebody who was a queer person who was happy and healthy and successful and grew up to be an adult. And that's powerful enough. How am I doing on time? Okay. Thank you all so much for listening to I know this was billed as a workshop. It wasn't really. But thank you. I'm not sure what's next. Do we have. We're supposed to have a spiritual moment, but I think people might still be in the other workshop. So hold on to your seats for the next spiritual moment. Okay. Okay.